I was asked to discuss working and communication with program officers in my experience. I will sign PO as program officer. That's what you'll see throughout the presentation. But I will discuss strategies. I'll share some experiences of mine, some successes, some failures, some mistakes I've made. I know in the beginning, sometimes there are fears about contacting the program officer, but it's important that you work to improve your relationship with the program officer to maximize your success and to give you opportunities to learn from the program officer and vice versa. I'll be reviewing different issues, different topics, and different tips as well. So I'll focus first on who program officers are. I'll talk about their roles. Then I will talk about how to successfully work with your program officer. That involves communication strategies. If you think that you're getting ready to submit a potential grant application, it's often a good idea to contact and sit down with your program officer. I'll discuss that. And then the third thing I plan to discuss is common issues and strategies to maximize your funding success. All right. So program officers. They typically are managers of the institutes or agencies, and they're able to help you brainstorm related to your passions, related to research, and how that might fit with the funding opportunities. It's very important to have your program officer involved at every step of the way. So program officers typically have a pool of money that they are able to access, and it may be from an agency, an institution, a foundation, etc. But they want great ideas, good science that fits their priorities and their criteria to be able to fund these opportunities. But each agency or institution has different priorities. So the program officer's role or responsibility is to try and find work out in the field that would fit the interest of the funding sources, and then help these individuals to come up with their ideas, to formulate these ideas and make them to fit with these opportunities. Most often, program officers are personable and easy to interact with, but we will discuss the things that are appropriate and not so appropriate to work with your program officer about for maximizing your success. I'll briefly mention some of their responsibilities. Program officers do give advice to individuals. They do not advise on what to spend or where to spend, but it's more about in your proposal, whether your proposal is a good idea and fits the categories or criteria of the funding sources. That's the type of advice they give, not specifics like, recommending if this could become or should become a clinical trial, or an RFA, if you're targeting a specific RFA for an application. There will be a program announcement or a PA, a program announcement, and the program officer can help explain to you whether that program announcement is a good idea or a good fit with your idea. So that's a potential advice that they could give. Now, they will not tell you that one measure or assessment is wrong or right. That's not their role. They will also inform the institute on which applicants they possibly should fund. So program officers are invited to review the grants as well with the review team. They will be able to give a score along with the review teams. And then the reviews help the program officer and then the institute to know if the science is strong or not. The program officer, from the rankings, the reviews, can decide from those scores. They evaluate the scores and see if it would fit the priorities and if you would be able to successfully meet your goals. Then they can recommend funding or not. The program officer does have to look closely. They do have a council that they bring together to discuss which grants to fund, which we will discuss more later. The third bullet point here, the program officer's role is also to oversee the progress. So as you go forward in your application process, you have specific aims. They will make sure that the grantee is working through that process appropriately. After you receive a grant, you have reporting maybe every 3 months, every 6 months, annually. Program officer helps make sure that you are on track for those things as well. Whether it's annual or quarterly reports, it's important that you involve the program officer in that process if you can, so that they can see your progress. If you have struggles with recruitment, for example, this year with COVID-19, with this pandemic, it's caused lots of disruptions with a variety of things. Our research in person has been shut down here in Michigan. A lot of research has transitioned to remote or virtual or been put on pause. That the pandemic has impacted a lot of research. So it's important to communicate with your program officer, and they do try and support you as much as they can. They want to see good research be successful and researchers to succeed. So it's very important for you to communicate well with your program officer ongoing. The fourth point here is about specific science funding opportunities. There are strategic plans for the future that these institutions and agencies have set, that they're looking for these gaps to be filled. In the last few years, more recent years, crises have happened. Probably about 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of funding from NIH has been more focused on the opioid crisis. They want to encourage research and opportunities for research for people working with the opioid crisis. So they're searching for researchers and trying to support researchers for that area of study. Also related to Alzheimer's. It's interesting that the money from Congress allocated to NIH for Alzheimer's funding has been focused on dementia and Alzheimer's research more recently. NIH is trying to balance their funding while facilitating and encouraging more researchers to be involved in the opioid crisis. But also, of course, there are other gaps that they need to focus on in research. And then, of course, with COVID-19 and this pandemic, NIH and various agencies are encouraging people to focus on researching COVID-19 and such impacts from that. So you want to make sure what the priorities are, and the program officer can help very much with that. At presentations and conferences, you can learn about what the institutes are looking for and what their priorities are for funding. At the end of the presentation, I will have some resources available for you. Don't try and strain your eyes reading this, but this is helpful information from Michael Spires. He is close to the University of Michigan. And he has done a wonderful job explaining some strategies that are helpful for framing this discussion today. There are several common issues that seem to be common across the board, so we will discuss those more later in the presentation. But on the left column, these things are don't, and then on the right column is do. So things that you should not do or things that you should do. There are some communication strategies that might be the wrong approach, and then others that might be a better approach with your program officer. If it's a grant application, suppose your grant application is denied and not approved, then there are tips for the right and wrong approaches for responding to that. So following up on the next slide.
So some of you may have experienced submitting different grants already. Sometimes you may feel great and very confident about a grant application. And then you may get negative feedback, you may have been rejected, or you may get positive feedback that your proposal was solid, but that it simply didn't fit the priorities of the agency or institution. I have experienced that before myself. Most of the time, that means that it's important to pay attention very closely to the institution or agency's funding priorities, like I mentioned before. It's very important to read the RFA very carefully, pay close attention to the instructions, and emphasize that in your grant application. And make sure that the priorities of your research are aligned with the priorities of the funding grant or institution. So in the past, people were encouraged to emphasize that less, but now we are encouraged to emphasize that more, and that's where this issue sometimes comes in. Now, when a person submits an application without paying attention to the Institute's priorities as well, it's important to, again, work very closely with the program officer and communicate with them to learn the priorities of the institution. Make sure that the research you're interested in doing aligns with the interests of the review committee and the funding agency. My approach for this, thinking about grants, first it depends on the size of the grant. For example, NIH is ready within a few months. It might take 3 months for an R01 to be prepared. So early on, I'll write an outline with some key points that I think would fit the funding agency and also fit what I'm interested in doing, what the study would aim to do. And then from there, I'll think about some aims and create an aims page. Sometimes that's also called the concept page. Now that aims page or concept page, once that's prepared, I'll contact the program officer. Now that's only one page. It's fairly short. It's not too in-depth. It definitely shouldn't be overwhelming or include too much detail. It should be concise and listed on only one page. And it should also be specific in the aims. And again, that's called the aims page or concept page. You can also add, what I tend to do is to add the RFA and the grant goals so that that can also be opened. So the program officer, the different program officers for the different RFAs and the different program announcements, they are responsible for so many different program announcements and RFAs that I like to put the link to the RFA on that page so that they can easily reference the grant that I'm interested in. And you should write this for a science audience. The program officer is familiar with science, but they may not be familiar with your very specific science. They may not be an expert in your field. So you should write it so that it can be understood by a layperson, so that the program officer understands what you want to do. If the program officer doesn't understand your aims, then you run the risk of that being forwarded to the review committee, who also won't be experts in your field, and then being rejected because they simply don't understand the science that you plan to do. So it's important to be prepared, and it's important that your page is concise and easy to understand. And it's almost like a sales pitch. You need to have a sales pitch ready as well, which is also similar to an elevator speech. It should be just about 2 or 3 minutes that you can describe your research when you meet with a program officer. Now, it's very easy these days to meet with a program officer by phone. In the past, program officers often preferred audio calls, and it wasn't easy to do video calls. But preparation and explanation is very important. They are busy, so you should be able to review your AIMS page very quickly in about 2 or 3 minutes to give them a description of what is most important for them to know. And then from there, they can review that and see if it fits their funding agency's goals and priorities. And that helps avoid the issue that I mentioned earlier on the last slide. It may be that you submitted it and thought that it would fit the funding agency, and then further review finds that it doesn't. That does happen sometimes, and that's all right. So now, more recently, thinking about which funding agency, which funding institution, there are many different foundations out there. There are also federal grant agencies such as NIH and NSF. Recently, we've also been running a program called M, because it's housed by the University of Michigan, M Disability. The letter M followed by disability. M Disability is a program specifically that focuses on increasing the inclusiveness of people with disabilities in clinical areas, medical education areas, community engagement, and research. Now, NIH supports researchers, but they don't always align with medical education, for example. So medical students who are learning patient care and learning how to work with patients with disability is sometimes missing. So it can be difficult to find an appropriate venue to submit grants that are along those lines, especially related to medical education. So we're looking in the next few years for funding and looking for sponsoring agencies to support this program, specifically for research. So it's important to look around and see what examples are available and what funding opportunities they funded in the past. Here at the bottom of the screen in the red box that I've just highlighted, there are 3 identified priorities that M Disability has. These are the priorities of this program. We know that the first 2 don't necessarily fit, but the third could be a fit, creating equitable communities for people with disabilities, ensuring that there's appropriate access, community programming, etc. So this third bullet point may help pique our curiosity and interest in applying for this funding opportunity. So there are a number of different places that list their priorities like this. And then in the past, it's also good to see what they've funded in the past. Sometimes they'll show grants that were given last year, 2 years ago. NIH also has a search portal that allows you to search for supported programs under NIH. So you can see if there's other research or other programs that are similar to what you're interested in doing. If it's too similar, then NIH or funding agencies may not want to pay for a duplicate study. So be sure to avoid any duplication and make sure that your research isn't too similar to what they've already funded in the past, but that it is somewhat similar. Another reason it's important to look at this is to see what grants they've funded before and what they've covered. So you want to look over that list. If we notice that there are no other programs with people with disabilities, that could be positive or it could be negative, depending. And so then we'll review that and discuss it. And in the process, we'll also think about potential aims that we would put on our aims page or concept page for our program. And we would want to explain the points of what we want to do and then contact the program officer and let them know that we're interested and that we feel that people with disabilities are a priority group that fits this third Equitable Communities Bulletin. And once we're ready, then we would submit our aims page or concepts page to them for review. So that's the general process for any funding agency, whether it be a private foundation, a federal agency like the NIH, they all tend to be fairly similar. And they do want to help us be successful too. Okay, so the second issue that comes up is sometimes people wonder the best strategy to communicate with their program officer. Unfortunately, for some grantees, the only way to communicate with their program officer is through their annual report. Unfortunately, sometimes that is the best way to communicate. But I want to review a few strategies that may help you develop a good working relationship with your program officer. Again, that is the goal. So I explained before that it's helpful to contact the program officer and ask for a short meeting before submitting your application proposal. So make sure to do that, and then also make sure to keep your emails very short, concise, and to the point, and demonstrate that you've already done the work and thought very carefully about your proposal. And ensure that it's very easy for them to understand your proposal and understand what you're trying to do. What I tend to do, often before emailing, for the first few years, I would contact the program officers by email, and I found that that wasn't always successful. Sometimes I found that it was more successful to set up a meeting, to request a bit of their time to talk with them directly, and to avoid explaining too much by email. Of course, program officers are very busy, and so sending a long email is not going to be the best way to reach them. They won't have the time to read it very closely. There may also be errors in understanding on their part too. So keep your emails to program officers very brief. And it's helpful to ask if they could take a few minutes to meet with you so that you can explain your goals. Again, that's going to be your elevator speech. And that can also help improve communication and improve your relationship with your program officer. Now, in the past, I have also called through VRS with voice carryover so that we can have that discussion by phone. Or of course, now video conferencing is much more popular. So using Zoom or something similar is also an option. And I'll show another example on the next slide. But here on the left, don't ask anything that would be easy to find at a medical library or from an assistant. Don't ask them to quickly review your entire application. Make sure that you read over the instructions and are following the instruction first. So do your homework before contacting the program officer. Don't ask them simple questions that you could easily find with a quick search online. That's really a waste of their time. So avoid potentially damaging your relationship with them by asking them questions that would be easy to find the answer to. That may make them feel like you're taking advantage of their time. On the do's column, it is fine to contact them. They do want to be contacted for appropriate reasons. If something isn't clear, if some part of the instructions are missing, sometimes mistakes do happen in RFAs, and that's an appropriate time to contact the program officers. You can ask them for some help and some explanation, or you can ask them to refer you to someone else who may know the answer. But again, keep it very brief and keep it to the point, and try to demonstrate that you have already done your homework, that you looked for the answer and you weren't able to find it. And so you're trying to find the answer by communicating in another way with the program officer. Here's an example of a recent communication that I had with a program officer. This is related to an R01 grant that was in its 4th year, but there was a unique opportunity released to receive an administrative supplement that was related to Alzheimer's and dementia research. So I wanted to see if I would be eligible for that supplement or if I had missed the timing for it because we were in our 4th year. I looked over the instructions and wasn't able to find any information about it. I knew I was in year 4 and people in year 4 were eligible. By the time I submitted an application, I wasn't sure if we would be in year 5 already, and therefore we might not be eligible if we wouldn't receive the supplemental funding until year 5. Now, the administrative supplement is not eligible to grants that are in their 5th year, so the timeline was a little bit unclear. I did my reading, I tried to look for the answer, I tried several different ways of finding the answer, and I was unsuccessful. So I decided to go ahead and reach out to the program officer. So what I did, you can see I sent this very brief email, and I asked them a specific question to see if my grant was eligible based on the RFA. I also put the RFA link in the email so that they could easily pull it up and so that they wouldn't have to try and find what my funding mechanism was first, so that they would be able to see it quickly. I also included a brief explanation of my question below. The program officer looked over it, they understood my question, but they weren't able to answer it themselves, which is fine, that happens. So they referred me to someone else. And so this was a successful communication with my program officer. And they did find that I was eligible. I had been concerned that I might not be eligible. And if I hadn't been comfortable enough to contact them, I may not have been able to receive that administrative supplement. But in the end, I was. And here you can see that I gave them the link and I asked them a very specific and concise question. And either the program officer will answer the question, or sometimes they'll refer to someone else who can help answer the question.
So issue 3. So you now have experience not getting a perfect score, but you have scores that are good, but not necessarily fundable for this specific opportunity. So then you have to think about if you want to drop that grant idea or resubmit. Sometimes that will require more conversation with the program officer. Each time I receive a grant, most of the time I will discuss the score with the program officer. Sometimes we as a team, if we don't get a good enough score to be funded, we might reach out to the program officer and talk about several of the different reviews and see what they might recommend. The program officer may advise that it's not the right fit for this grant opportunity or offer other RFA opportunities or lead us in a different direction. One mistake I have made also when I was an early researcher, and many people do, I submitted a grant, was turned down, and I became depressed and I just felt bad about it. But no, it's important that you take a break, disconnect from it a little bit, and then review closely the comments from the reviewers. Most of the time, the reviewers are volunteers, or they might be paid a very small amount to provide feedback. Sometimes it's disappointing. Sometimes you might change your mind about the grant and resubmitting it, but it's important that you do take a time to think about things, to calm yourself down, to review the comments and feedback, and then consider whether you want to pursue this further or not, and then contact the program officer to discuss further, whatever you decide. Most funded grants require resubmission multiple times, so you often have to be persistent. I would say don't submit once and then drop it and don't submit it again or resubmit. No, be patient. Review the reviewer's comments, try to understand them, make adjustments in your resubmission, talk to your program officer, and adjust as appropriate. I encourage you to think about being proactive. When you're reviewing the comments, the feedback, think about how to address them. Suppose your grant application was not funded. Think about revising and resubmitting and whether it would be worth it, worthy purpose of your time. Another example, I typed up a council letter. So I got the reviewer scores, and the funding agency receives the applications, they review it, and then they meet with their council. So often the first submission, your score is not great. So for example, NIH, 18% pay line is what they kind of go by. So if it's less than 15%, you possibly won't be funded. It can sometimes benefit you to contact the program officer because your priorities seem to fit the agency's priorities, and you may have thought it was a good fit. When I was a new investigator, I did learn that it was good to consider a variety of options. NIH does look for newer investigators. They like to increase the pipeline in such a way. If they overfund experienced researchers, there won't be funds for the newer researchers. So they want to make sure that they spread the funds across the board as well as they can. So it's good that you look to make sure that you fit the criteria. Think about the type of researcher you are in your career and what the agency's goals are. Now, as far as reviewers of your grant, you might have 4 reviewers and 3 are really positive, and then 1 is really awful feedback. So it might be beneficial to contact the program officer and discuss the feedback from the reviewers. There will often be general comments, and then each different reviewer will discuss more specific about how your application fits or does not fit their priorities. One big concern that reviewers have will often be mentioned. Now, I will explain this grant I'm talking about was not funded after this, but we did talk to the program officer. We reviewed the feedback we got. And it seemed that those who reviewed and the program officer didn't seem to get the cultural view of deafness. And they had a more autistic view of that. So it was very interesting that my discussion with the program officer helped them to become a better advocate for future funding opportunities because they learned from that process. Helped them understand our goal, and that influenced future funding opportunities. So the second reason that this was helpful and that timing is important, it forced me to think about the reviewer's comments. Of the 3 good reviewer feedback portions that I received, I saw where our strengths were and then learned where I needed to make changes to strengthen the weak parts. And then we had the council letter that we could attach with it when I resubmitted. The third comment was 28% not funded. And once in a while, you can be surprised. I have a colleague who did receive funding from a grant that received a score of 33%. He didn't think that he would get funded, but he really did. They actually did get their grant funded because there was a large gap in the research area that they applied for. and it fit with the priorities of the Institute. So even though my colleague's score was less than other applications, there was such a large gap in their research area, the agency was willing to fund them. So it could help to, sometimes they go back and review to fit their priorities for funding. And also, if they see a grant come through, then, and it may not be funded right away, but they might keep that in mind for following funding opportunities and contact you again to see if you want to reapply for a new funding opportunity. Okay, similarly, about being too afraid to contact the program officer. Of course, sometimes people feel intimidated to approach the program officer. You might not think that you have anything important to say, or they might think that you're stupid or you're shy, but there are ways to overcome this. It's important to learn before you go to conferences. You learn about funding priorities, their different programs. You might be able to set up a one-on-one meeting at the conference itself. So learn about the program officer and the programs before you approach them. That can be very helpful. You don't want them to miss out on an opportunity, because program officers and institutions want diversity, including deaf and hard of hearing individuals and other people with disabilities. So don't be shy. Program officers are looking for opportunities, and they want to learn about you too. And even if your program or your application or your idea is not ready to submit yet, and you're in the early stages of thinking and planning for it, you still could talk to them about potential training opportunities or sponsorships from NIH, different conferences or areas that you could be involved in and learn to prepare yourself for future applications that you might submit. So as I started making more contact with program officers, when I first started doing that, I would invite my mentor to the meetings. The first program officer that I met was not one that I dealt with for actual grants that I have received. The first program officer that I met with helped become a sort of mentor to me and helped me learn how to interact with future program officers. So again, it's important that you look to see if the agency's priorities will fit with your research, and talk to them about your thoughts and your interests and your future plans for research. Diversity is valued. NIH, National Institutes of Health, is a perfect example. At RIT, they have the Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate program, funding from NIH. That is a training program that searches for diversity. They emphasize that NIH wants URM, underrepresented minorities, which includes deaf and hard of hearing individuals as well. It's important to think about various opportunities. We all, as deaf or hard of hearing individuals, have unique experiences as researchers. We have unique experience for cultural content, advancing in life and our experiences, plus unique views as a researcher on measures, on creativity and ideas that we can contribute. So it's important to explore a variety of avenues and see where you might be able to kind of troubleshoot in different areas, because they are looking for diversity. So now that you're feeling more confident and more brave, you can think about opportunities for developing that relationship even more with your program officer. There's a specific health literacy conference that I attended a few years ago, and I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to contact the program officer and invite them to the conference. We had a panel, invited them to learn more about what we were doing. The conference also offered an opportunity for one-on-one meetings. You could sign up for a time slot to meet with the program officer. I think it was 15 minutes or a half an hour, but very briefly. But we had the opportunity to meet different individuals, different researchers. The program officer wanted to learn more about their programs. Researchers could ask about future RFAs that might be coming down the pipeline. So that was a good opportunity for people to make connection with the program officers and the program officers to learn about our work. Also, a benefit for the panel included deaf and hard of hearing individuals, but that approach could translate to different groups of people with other types of disabilities as well. So that panel was helpful. NIH needs to support grants that are inclusive of people with all disabilities, whatever it may be. And not just groups of underrepresented minorities by race, but also by disability. And they're starting to recognize this more and more. So we're hopeful that in the future, NIH will develop more research that is more inclusive of people with disabilities. So I encourage you to look for opportunities such as conferences. Look for opportunities to have time set aside one-on-one with program officers, and think about future research opportunities or ideas that you may have that you could discuss with potential program officers.
Conferences also sometimes select presentations or posters, and either a presentation or a poster is a great opportunity to showcase your work. That gives you a chance to show the hard work that you've done. And program officers do attend conferences, and they do look at what's going on in the field. They want to see potential opportunities for grant sponsorship, and also what research is going on, and the outcomes of different research projects. So it's important to show your work at conferences, and that's again an opportunity to meet with program officers and talk about your specific work. Recently, another colleague of mine had a program officer from the PCORI Institute, the Patient Outcome Research Institute, which is a medical funding institute. The program officer approached this person, my colleague, because of a poster that they had on communication disabilities at a conference. The program officer had already heard from the advisory board, the PCORI advisory board, that they were experiencing patients, community members, and other gatekeepers who had said that there's not enough focus on people with disabilities, and that they wanted to support more people with disabilities. The program officer agreed, and so they were specifically searching for opportunities to fund research on people with disabilities. So sometimes program officers will proactively look for research that fits potential funding opportunities. So my colleague was encouraged to apply for PCORI grants, and they've now been funded for 2 different grants through the PCORI Institute. So either a presentation or a poster is sometimes a great way to get attention from program officers who are looking for potential grantees. So I would encourage you to think about that angle as well. I also encourage you, especially if you're earlier in your career, but even if you're not, to look at different funding agencies. Look at their strategic plans. Look at their funding priorities. Look at what they want to support, especially what they want to support in the future. And then think about what your passions are and your mission statement, and think about whether you would fit with any of these funding agencies, or if there are some funding agencies that wouldn't be a good fit for you. So for example, this is NIDCD and their strategic plan under NIH. NIH releases strategic plans every 5 years. So I showed you a few minutes ago an example of a multidisciplinary, not only focused on research, but focused on developing programs to increase inclusion of people with disabilities. So that's very helpful. That forced me to look for other foundation support and other grants. Many foundation grants are a great opportunity to develop pilot studies and collect pilot data. That pilot data can then help you prepare to submit a larger grant, such as an R01 or a more significant grant. So that can also be a helpful stepping stone. So think broadly and be open-minded about funding opportunities. Talk with your grant administrator. Sometimes medical librarians can also be helpful. You can also sign on to different listservs and email lists so that you can keep an eye out on funding opportunities as they're released. This is a challenge that I hear fairly often, is that hearing loss is viewed as a biomedical issue and not as a cultural issue or diversity issue. So it's important to remember when this comes up, and I explained my experience with the council of trying to help them understand the cultural lens of deafness, but also with NIH and other institutes may not necessarily view people with disabilities as a priority. Some of them may be interested in underrepresented minorities, but they don't immediately recognize that people who are deaf or disabled are members of an underrepresented minority group. So it's important to meet and talk about these things with people and challenge them sometimes. Encourage them to think more broadly about underrepresented minorities and about inclusion and diversity. Invite them to sit down with you and ask them why not include this if you include this. That can also open up other opportunities. So I would encourage you to think not only of your grants, but also of opening opportunities for other people as well. Another challenge, especially before video conferencing, was using the phone. And if you remember, I said that email isn't always the best way to communicate with program officers. Back in the day, we did use VRS with voice carryover, but one negative of that is that sometimes the interpreter isn't qualified or the interpreter is switched in the middle of a call. Some science jargon is difficult to interpret, as is medical jargon. So I encourage you to think about having a designated interpreter, an interpreter who you know well and who knows you well, who you can contact for those meetings. These days, it's much easier to set things up with Zoom. In the past, we had WebEx, which wasn't the best. It was a little bit more limited. But these days, Zoom is very easy to use. It's easy to set up three-way communication, and that makes it much easier to communicate directly with program officers. Email is always an option. I do recommend emailing first to request a meeting. But one example is for grant obligations, that's more urgent. But for any clarifications, sometimes to share resources and sometimes to network. For example, to share resources related to COVID. I work with a funding agency that was encouraging more grants related to COVID, but we still haven't received them. And so we encourage them to look for more funding opportunities. But at the same time, I also wanted to share resources with them. I wanted them to be aware of deaf-blind patients and opportunities to support them, for example. So sharing resources with program officers can also be beneficial. And again, that helps develop a relationship with them. But you should have already developed that relationship at conferences and through more in-person communication as well. That gives you the opportunity to then improve the relationship by sharing resources. Okay, here are several resources, and I think we will share the slides with attendees after the presentation is over. It may be helpful to review some of these articles. And some grant application workbooks are also helpful. That's very good because it summarizes a lot of the key points for applying to grants. Some colleges and universities have grant writing courses as well. I encourage you to take advantage of those to develop a strong application. So now what I'm going to do is just show you the contact information slide here. And then we will open up the opportunity for, I'll stop sharing the slides in just a minute. And then I will take a look at the chat. And if there are any questions, we can discuss from there. All right. And any stories too. Everyone would benefit from hearing stories and experiences as well. Thank you. And thank you to the interpreters too.
My story, one time I submitted a grant application. The score was okay, but it was turned down. So I went to a conference. And at that conference, the program officer actually came up to me and said, guess what? Your previous application actually had the review committee changeover. Someone was actually kicked off of the committee. And so we suggest that you resubmit your application because it might be successfully funded now. So I did, and it was successfully funded. So I really appreciated that. And yes, like you mentioned, I was depressed and frustrated when I was turned down for that. And so I was really thankful that the program officer came up to me at the conference, talked to me about that, and that gave me enough motivation to adjust and resubmit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. There are a couple questions here. One of the questions is, could you explain the conference where you invited the program officers? Was that a national conference? And yes, it was a national conference. Now, sometimes on review for different abstracts, it is sometimes an option to ask for help finding a program officer to invite. And so I said that I would be happy to invite the program officer to see if they could join the panel. And they were welcome at the panel and to attend the conference. And so that was a successful experience. That was a national conference. The second question, was the program officer involved in the letter of intent? LOI. Thank you, Peter. The letter of intent. So I submitted that to the program officer to review before I sent it to the council. That also helps decide which requests are accepting applications. Now, a letter of intent tends to be more for like the Pecori Institute. It tends to be more for foundation grants, not for grants like NIH, for example. And that is a way of judging interest. It helps them to know which grantees may be interested in the application and then which grantees have been accepted for grants. So that helps prepare the review committee for reviewing grant applications. Thank you for asking about that.
Bob said, if you don't mind mentioning one thing that the program officers advise about funding mechanisms for research. In NIH, for example, they have different institutions within them that have different funding announcements. So they will usually focus on a specific area of research. It may be on a cycle of sorts. So a research opportunity you might apply for and be rejected, and then it'll be a while before you can resubmit because of the cycle that it's on. Sometimes the program officer might know if the funding opportunity will be continuing for a while, or if it's just a one-time shot or not, or if it's renewable. The program officer typically knows those things. So it is helpful to contact program officers to search for opportunities. Like I mentioned, the opioid abuse. There are more limited opportunities now than there were a few years ago, but there are still some opportunities because they do recognize that they, like maybe not at this one particular institute is funding it still, but it might be another area. Or if we want to look at specifically the deaf and hard of hearing population, there might be areas that we could look for funding opportunities for researching the deaf and hard of hearing population with the opioid crisis. So it's helpful to search the different institutions and look for opportunities for collaborations. And program officers can be very helpful in identifying other RFAs or other institutions that you might have overlooked because of their involvement with the institution. So again, don't be shy. Contact the program officer. It's, of course, first important for you to look through and see if the funding opportunity is available, and then you can reach out and learn about other opportunities. Sometimes from my experience, if I remember one specific example, I contacted them and I was told it will be released in the future, which is helpful to know also, because then you can get everything ready and prepared so that once that RFA is released, you can jump on board and submit your application. Also, R01, R23, the K awards. There are many different awards that you could apply for. And so the question is how to differentiate those. The K is an opportunity for training grant opportunity. That's more for clinical and medical training, not the research training. So a K award is helpful in one setting versus the other. So it can be helpful to take your time to look into the different opportunities. And if you're looking at a training grant, make sure that you get the appropriate one. So one is called the K award and the other is called an R series. So there's an R03, an R21, R01, and others. There's a large PU also. But what you most commonly will probably see, an R03 is a smaller award. It's typically about $50,000 or so, and it's a good pilot opportunity to start developing pilot data, and then that can help you prepare to submit a full R01 or R21. With the R21, that's kind of the middle stage, about $250,000 per year. And again, that asks for a little bit of data to be collected, but not as much as an R01. Now, the R01 grant expects the researcher, to already have more extensive grant experience and data to be able to then apply for the grant for 5 years. It's a larger grant, usually $500,000 annually or above. And those are a couple of those mechanisms. Another question here. One person asked if I have experience contacting program officers from other sponsors, not only NIH or PCORI. And yes, I do. The Nielsen Foundation is one. They work with people with physical disabilities. So I have contacted the program officer there. It's helpful to see if your team knows the program officer, and if not, you might try to contact them at a conference or check out their webpage or something if you're interested in looking into a funding opportunity for a different organization. And it depends on the size of the funding opportunity that you're looking for. It is helpful to discuss with the program officers from various agencies or institutes and talk about the different procedures or protocols for each one and see whether foundations or agencies or institutes might be the best for your type of research. Talking with the program officer can be challenging, especially in small foundations, because there may be one program officer who's very busy and overwhelmed and may be difficult to contact or get good conversation with, but it's helpful to do so. Blue Cross Blue Shield, that foundation is one that I have contacted often or tried to contact a program officer and had lots of difficulty doing so. Bob reminded me of another foundation that does a lot of funding for deaf and hard of hearing related research that we've partnered with. Some individuals here at RIT partner with me also. Brandeis University is another one that I partner with. For example, here at University of Michigan, we collaborate with different sites, focusing more on physical disabilities again, but it varies from like hearing, vision, physical disabilities, the variety. But interesting, the scoring is opposite from NIH. Their review process is very in-depth and intense, and they provide takeaway points. NIH gives more points. I guess the weaker your application is, but this other foundation will take away points. So the scoring is different. But anyway, related to COVID-19, the program officer is becoming more stringent on overseeing things. I would recommend a similar approach, trying to contact the program officer, seeing if your research idea fits the criteria for the programs that they're offering, see if they like the idea, if they agree that it would fit, etc. I would say it's a similar approach, regardless the foundation, whether it's federal or private, similar approach with contacting your program officer. I appreciate you joining, and I can stay for a moment in case other questions come up, but thank you again for your time.